Okay, so Wilson, early 20th century America, things are really heating up, aren't they? Massive industry, cities booming, all this immigration.
Absolutely, a real pressure cooker, like you said. And Wilson's there trying to manage this whirlwind of change.
Right. And you're looking to understand his impact, sort of get the core of his first term policies, the big domestic stuff especially,
Yeah.
without drowning in details.
Exactly. Think of this as, well, the essential guide to those early Wilson years. We've boiled down the sources, focusing on his main domestic goals and his initial take on foreign affairs, the really pivotal things.
Okay, let's start with Wilson himself, a Virginian, which, given the Civil War wasn't that long ago, makes him the first president from a state that seceded since Zachary Taylor.
That's right. And beyond where he came from, he was a serious academic. He'd really thought deeply about government.
He believed in a strong presidency, didn't he?
Yeah.
That the president needed to kind of drive the legislative agenda.
Very much so. His view is that Congress, well, it needed presidential leadership to get big things done. The government sets the laws, the courts apply them. That was his framework.
And he wasn't shy about going over Congress's head, appealing directly to the public.
Not at all. He saw public opinion as a powerful tool. But, we have to be upfront about Wilson. There's a really troubling side.
Racial views.
Yes. His white supremacist beliefs are, well, they're documented, and a real lack of concern for African American rights. It's impossible to ignore that.
It really is. And it casts a shadow over his progressive achievements, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. We'll see how those reforms often didn't extend to everyone, or sometimes even made things worse for minority groups. It's a stark reminder that progressive era didn't mean progress for all.
Right. Now, thinking about him compared to, say, Teddy Roosevelt, how do they differ? Both progressives, but different styles.
Definitely different styles. Wilson was maybe less keen on direct government activism in the economy than TR. He didn't quite have that same common touch, that popular appeal.
And maybe more. Moralistic. Uncompromising.
Perhaps more rigid sometimes, yeah. But he came into office with a very clear agenda. He called it his attack on the triple wall of privilege.
The triple wall. Okay, what specifically was he targeting there?
It was his shorthand for what he saw as the three big barriers to fairness. First, the tariff high import taxes protecting big business. Second, the banks, the outdated, unstable financial system. And third, the trust's too much economic power in too few corporate hands.
So tariffs, banks, trusts, and he actually made major moves on all three in his first term.
He really did. It was an incredibly productive legislative period those first 4 years. He came in with a plan and, well, he executed it.
Okay, let's take that first wall.
Yeah.
The tariff, the Underwood Tariff Bill in 1913. He addressed Congress in person for this, which is unusual then, wasn't it?
Highly unusual. Presidents hadn't really done that since Jefferson, maybe Adams. It showed how important he thought this was.
And it worked. He pushed it through.
Well, it passed the House relatively easily, got tougher in the Senate. So Wilson, again, went straight to the public, urged people to tell their senators, pass this bill.
And that pressure worked.
It seemed to. The bill passed, and it meant a pretty significant cut in tariffs. Dropped the average rate from, I think, around 40% down to about 29%.
But that wasn't all the Underwood tariff did, right? There was something else major linked to it. The income tax.
Exactly. This is where the 16th Amendment comes in. It had just been ratified, allowing for a federal income tax. The Underwood Tariff Act put it into practice.
The graduated income tax.
Yes, graduated. Started low, just 1% on incomes over $4,000, which is a decent amount back then, but went up to 7% for incomes over $500,000.
And did it make a difference financially for the government?
Oh, absolutely. It was a game changer. By 1917, just a few years later, the money coming in from the income tax actually exceeded the revenue from tariffs.
Wow. So that's a fundamental shift in how the government pays for itself.
A massive, lasting shift, moving away from relying so heavily on import taxes.
Okay, wall one tackled. Next, the banks. The old National Banking Act system had shown its weaknesses, especially during, the Panic of 1907.
Precisely. That panic really exposed the problems. The big ones were the inelasticity of money. The currency supply couldn't easily adjust to economic needs.
Couldn't stretch or shrink.
Right. And the other issue was where the money reserves were held, mostly concentrated in big banks in the East. So if there was trouble elsewhere, it was hard to get funds flowing.
So what was the proposed solution before Wilson?
Well, the Republicans generally favored creating another big national bank, sort of like the first and second banks of the United States, but privately run.
But the Democrats, influenced by investigations like the Pujo Committee.
Yeah.
They had concerns about that, right? About Wall Street having too much power.
Exactly. The Pujo Committee highlighted just how much financial clout was concentrated in a few hands on Wall Street. This idea of a money monopoly really took hold.
And people like Lou Brandeis were writing about this too.
Yes, Brandeis's book, Other People's Money and How the Bankers Use It, was hugely influential. It really fueled the argument against that kind of centralized private control.
So Wilson goes back to Congress again, June 1913, and he pushes for a different kind of system.
He does. He argues for a system that's decentralized, spread across the country, but crucially, under government control, not a private bank.
And that leads to the Federal Reserve Act.
Yes, later in 1913, and it's often called the most important piece of economic legislation between the Civil War and the New Deal, which is saying something.
So what did it actually do? How did it restructure things?
Okay, so it created the Federal Reserve Board in Washington with members appointed by the president. That's the government oversight part.
Right.
Then it divided the country into 12 districts, each with its own regional Federal Reserve Bank.
Okay, so decentralized, but who owned those regional banks?
Technically, the member banks within each district owned their regional Fed bank. But the key was the Federal Reserve Board having the ultimate authority, public control over this network.
And it addressed the currency issue, too.
It did. The board was given the power to issue Federal Reserve notes, basically, the paper money we still use today. This allowed the money supply to be more flexible, to expand and contract as needed.
So a huge step. Did it solve everything, prevent future depressions?
Well, it was definitely a huge modernization. It helped navigate the financial crises of World War I. But no, as we know, it didn't prevent the Great Depression later on. Still a landmark achievement.
Two walls down. Tariff, banks. Now, the trusts. Wilson goes back to Congress again in early 1914.
He does, this time asking for legislation to regulate trusts more effectively. And this leads to the Federal Trade Commission Act.
The FTC, what was its job supposed to be?
Its main role was to be a watchdog over businesses involved in interstate commerce.
Right.
To look out for unfair practices.
Like what kind of practices?
Things like false advertising, mislabeling products, commercial bribery, adulteration. Basically, unfair competition. The FTC could issue cease and desist orders against companies doing these things.
So it had some teeth.
Some, yes. But its enforcement powers weren't incredibly strong initially. And, who Wilson appointed to the commission also affected how aggressive it was.
Okay. And then came another act related to trusts, the Clayton Antitrust Act, also 1914.
That's right. The idea behind the Clayton Act was to bolster the original Sherman Antitrust Act from 1890.
While being more specific.
Exactly. It spelled out specific business practices that were now illegal. Things like price discrimination, charging different customers different prices for the same product if it lessened competition. And also interlocking directorates.
Or the same person sits on the board of competing companies.
Right. Though the enforcement of that part was a bit weak, honestly. But maybe the most talked about part of the Clayton Act was about labor.
Ah, yes. It exempted unions from antitrust laws.
It did. Labor unions and agricultural organizations were specifically told they couldn't be prosecuted as illegal combinations and restraint of trade under the antitrust laws. It also explicitly legalized peaceful strikes and picketing.
That sounds like a massive win for labor. Samuel Gompers called it the Magna Carta of labor, didn't he?
He did, yeah. It was seen as hugely important. But, like the FTC, there were maybe some caveats.
Such as?
Well, the act didn't go into super specific detail about exactly which union activities were protected, and Wilson apparently wasn't eager to push for even stronger language. It was partly a reaction to court rulings like the Danbury Hatters case, where union members had been held personally liable.
So a big step, but maybe not the final word. Still, union membership grew after this.
Oh, yes. The AFL saw significant growth by 1917.
Okay, so Wilson tackles his triple wall, but the progressive reforms didn't stop there, did they? Especially heading into the 1916 election.
Sure. Things kept moving, and yeah, the upcoming election likely played a role. Wilson started embracing more progressive ideas, some that sounded a bit like Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism, maybe to broaden his appeal.
Like appointing Louis Brandeis to the Supreme Court. That was a big statement.
Huge. Brandeis was known as the people's lawyer, very much associated with progressive causes. A very visible appointment.
And there was a whole raft of other legislation around this time, too.
Absolutely. A real flurry. You had the Federal Farm Loan Act, low-interest credit for farmers, kind of a populist idea, really.
Right.
The Warehouse Act loans based on stored crops, another old populist goal. The Federal Highway Act for rural roads. the Smith-Levy Act for agricultural education.
What about labor specifically? Anything else beyond Clayton?
Yes, the La Follette-Siemens Act improved conditions on merchant ships. The Working Men's Compensation Act helped federal employees who got injured. And then there was the Child Labor Act of 1916.
The first federal attempt to regulate child labor.
Using the interstate commerce power, yes. A big deal, although the Supreme Court later struck it down, unfortunately.
We'll get to the court. Anything else significant?
The Adamson Act stands out. It mandated an 8-hour day for interstate railroad workers. Plus, there was growing momentum towards minimum wages and even changes in thinking about prisons more focused on rehabilitation.
So a broad range of reforms. But you mentioned the Supreme Court. They weren't always on board with this progressive wave.
Definitely not. The court during this period was generally quite conservative. It often acted as a brake on progressive legislation.
Like striking down that Child Labor Act. Any other famous examples?
Well, the Lochner v. New York case is a classic. Initially, the court struck down a New York law limiting bakers' work hours. Though parts of that were later modified, it showed their skepticism towards labor regulation. And later, in Adkins v. Children's Hospital, they overturned a minimum wage law for women in D.C.
So definite tension there. But the court also made some important rulings on things like free speech, didn't it? Like Schenck v. U.S.
Yes, Schenck is crucial, even though it was technically 1919, just after this first term. That's where Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes introduced the clear and present danger test.
The famous fire in a crowded theater idea.
Exactly. The idea that free speech isn't absolute. It can be limited if it creates an immediate danger. But, importantly, Holmes also stressed the need to protect even ideas we hate. A complex ruling.
And speaking of justices, we mentioned Brandeis. His appointment was significant not just politically, but also because he was the first Jewish justice.
That's right, a truly historic appointment. And his impact went beyond just representation.
You mean his legal approach, the Brandeis?
Yes. He pioneered this method, most famously in Muller v. Oregon, even before he was on the court. Instead of just legal arguments, he presented tons of social and economic data to show the real-world impact of laws.
And that worked in Muller.
It did. That case upheld an Oregon law limiting women's working hours, partly based on the social evidence Brandeis presented. It changed how lawyers argued these kinds of cases. He had a long, influential career, even when writing dissents.
Okay, shifting gears a bit to major social movements. Prohibition. That really gained steam in the progressive era, didn't it?
Massively. You had long-standing groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, led by Frances Willard. They were very effective, linking temperance to other reforms like suffrage.
And they weren't alone.
No, they allied with the Anti-Saloon League, which was incredibly focused and politically shrewd. They pushed hard for dry laws at the state and local level.
So it was already happening piece by piece before becoming national.
Oh, yes. Large parts of the country were already dry, especially rural areas. Cities, often with large immigrant populations, tended to stay wet.
And World War I played a role in the final push.
A big role. The war fostered this atmosphere of sacrifice. Consuming alcohol, using grain for brewing. It started to seem unpatriotic. The government even limited alcohol production.
And that momentum led to the 18th Amendment.
Exactly. Passed Congress, ratified in 1919, banned the manufacture, sale, or transportation of alcoholic beverages. Then the Volstead Act provided the enforcement details.
But ultimately, it didn't really work out as planned.
No. Prohibition is often seen as one of the great failures of the progressive era. Maybe trying to legislate personal behavior on that scale was just, well, overreach.
Another huge social change. Women's suffrage. This fight went way back, right? Seneca Falls, 1848.
All the way back. Figures like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, they were the pioneers.
How had the movement evolved by Wilson's time? Was it unified?
It had gone through phases, including a split, but by the early 20th century, the main group was the National American Women's Suffrage Association, NASA. Under Carrie Chapman Catt, it became a really powerful force.
And Catt changed the strategy somewhat.
She did. She started arguing less about abstract rights and more about how suffrage would help women in their practical, traditional roles, especially in modern cities. You know, needing a say on school boards, public health, policing.
Making it seem less radical, perhaps?
Possibly. More about women needing the vote to be effective wives and mothers in this new urban environment. And NASA used sophisticated tactics.
Like lobbying, parades.
Yes, Catt's winning plan involved state-by-state campaigns, lobbying, organizing huge parades, getting publicity.
But there was also a more radical wing, wasn't there, Alice Paul?
Yes, Alice Paul and the Congressional Union, later the National Women's Party. They took cues from the British suffragettes' more militant tactics like picketing the White House, hunger strikes when arrested. They focused solely on a federal amendment.
So different approaches,
Hmm.
but the pressure was building. What finally tipped the balance?
A combination of factors. Nazis' steady work, Alice Paul's attention-grabbing protests, and then women's crucial contributions during World War I really made it hard to deny them the vote. Wilson himself finally came around and publicly supported a federal amendment. Plus, the anti-suffrage liquor industry was weakened by looming prohibition.
And that led to the 19th Amendment in 1920.
Finally, yes, granting full suffrage nationwide, a monumental victory after decades of struggle. And interesting to note, Jeannette Rankin, the first woman elected to Congress, actually introduced the bill.
An incredible achievement. But while women gained the vote, the picture for African Americans during this same era was much, much bleaker.
Tragically so. You know, for all the talk of progress, this era saw very little for Black Americans. In fact, some things got worse.
Even symbolic gestures faced backlash, like TR having dinner with Booker T. Washington.
Exactly. The outrage over that was intense, and TR kind of backed away from visible support afterwards.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you have the Great Migration starting Black families moving north for opportunity, but often facing horrible violence.
Race riots, like the one in Chicago.
Yes, the Chicago race riot of 1919 was brutal. Dozens killed, hundreds injured, federal troops called in, and lynchings continued at an appalling rate across the South.
But there was resistance, activism within the Black community. People like Ida B. Wells.
Absolutely. Ida B. Wells was incredibly courageous, a journalist who risked her life documenting and exposing the horrors of lynching. A true hero.
And then there was the famous debate between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about the best path forward.
Yes, a fundamental disagreement. Washington advocated for gradual progress through vocational education and economic self-help, essentially accepting segregation for the time being, accommodationism.
Which Du Bois strongly opposed.
Vehemently. Du Bois, coming from a different background, educated in the North and Europe, demanded immediate social and political equality. He saw Washington's approach as undermining the fight for civil rights. He called for the development of a Black intellectual elite, the talented 10th, to lead the fight.
And Du Bois helped found organizations to push for that.
Yes. First, the Niagara Movement, which explicitly demanded an end to segregation and discrimination. Then, after a horrific race riot in Springfield, Illinois Lincoln's hometown Du Bois joined with white progressives to form the NAACP in 1909.
The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
Right. Du Bois became its director of publicity and research and editor of its magazine, The Crisis. The NAACP adopted the goals of the Niagara Movement and became the leading force fighting for Black rights through legal challenges and advocacy.
So organizing and resistance were growing, but overall progress was limited. And Wilson himself, his record on race is pretty damning, isn't it?
It really is. His own writings showed his white supremacist views. He famously praised the racist film Birth of a Nation.
The one glorifying the KKK.
That's the one. And while some discriminatory legislation he favored didn't pass, his administration actively increased segregation within the federal government itself in Washington, D.C.
Reversing progress that had been made earlier.
Exactly. Setting back Black federal employees significantly. And the Democratic Party under him really offered no place for African Americans. That wouldn't start to change until the New Deal era.
A very stark contrast to the other progressive reforms. Okay, let's shift to Wilson's foreign policy in this first term, setting aside World War I for now. He came in saying he disliked imperialism, right? Moving away from TR's big stick and Taft's dollar diplomacy.
Oh, that was the rhetoric, yes. He definitely expressed an aversion to the kind of interventionism his predecessors practiced.
The reality was different.
Well, it was complicated. Paradoxically, Wilson ended up intervening militarily in Latin America more than Roosevelt or Taft. Often the pressure came from U.S. corporations worried about instability or wanting protection for their investments.
So what were some of the anti-imperialist moves he did make?
He withdrew special government support for American investors in Latin America and China. He pushed Congress to repeal the Panama Canal Tolls Act, which had unfairly exempted U.S. ships. The Jones Act of 1916 promised eventual independence for the Philippines.
And Puerto Rico.
The Jones Act of 1917 granted Puerto Ricans U.S. statutory citizenship, though not statehood or full self-government. He also managed a tense situation with Japan over California, trying to restrict land ownership for Japanese immigrants. Secretary of State Bryan helped smooth that over.
Okay, but then there were the interventions. Where did those happen?
Despite his words, U.S. Marines stayed in Nicaragua. He sent troops into Haiti in 1915 after their president was assassinated, basically establishing a U.S. protectorate that lasted for years.
Why Haiti?
Ostensibly to restore order and protect American interests, but it resulted in long-term U.S. control. Then intervention in the Dominican Republic in 1916 due to debts and civil unrest, and the U.S. purchased the Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917, reinforcing U.S. presence in the Caribbean.
So a real contradiction between rhetoric and action. And then there's Mexico. That was incredibly messy.
Extremely messy. Mexico was in the midst of a revolution against a longtime dictator, Porfirio Diaz. Lots of foreign investment, including American, was tied up there.
Wilson didn't like the leader who took over after the initial revolution, did he? Horta.
No. Victoriano Huerta came to power in a coup, overthrowing the elected president Madero, who was then killed. Wilson considered Huerta's government illegitimate, immoral even, and refused to recognize it. He wanted Huerta out.
And he supported Huerta's rivals, Carranza and Pancho Villa.
Initially, yes. Wilson massed troops on the border trying to pressure Huerta. Then came the Tampico incident in 1914.
What happened there?
Some U.S. sailors were briefly arrested by Huerta's forces. Mexico apologized, but refused Wilson's demand for a 21-gun salute to the U.S. flag, unless the U.S. returned the salute, which would imply recognition of Huerta's government.
And Wilson got angry.
Furious. He asked Congress for authority to use force. Then, hearing a German ship was delivering weapons to Huerta, Wilson ordered the U.S. Navy to seize the port of Veracruz.
Seize a major Mexican port. How did that go over?
Badly. Very badly. There was fighting, casualties on both sides. Mexicans, even Huerta's opponents like Carranza, were outraged at the U.S. invasion. There was condemnation across Latin America and even in the U.S.
Did it achieve Wilson's goal? Get Huerta out?
Eventually, yes. Mediation by Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, the ABC powers, helped ease Huerta out. But Carranza, who then took power, deeply resented the U.S. intervention.
And the chaos continued with Pancho Villa.
Yes. Villa soon broke with Carranza. The U.S. initially backed Carranza. Then Villa, feeling betrayed, started attacking Americans, first in Mexico, then raiding Columbus, New Mexico in 1916.
So Wilson sent the army after Villa.
He did. General John J. Pershing led an expedition deep into Mexico to capture Villa. They went in without Carranza's permission, clashed with Mexican government troops, and never actually caught Villa.
Another intervention that didn't go well.
Not at all. It was deeply unpopular on both sides of the border. Mexicans demanded the U.S. leave. Many Americans wanted the troops brought home too, especially as the situation in Europe was getting much more dangerous.
So the U.S. eventually pulled out.
Yes. Pershing's forces withdrew in February 1917, largely because the threat of war with Germany was becoming unavoidable. The whole Mexican adventure was seen as a failure, really damaging Wilson's foreign policy reputation. So much so, it was largely rejected in the 1920s.
Right. Yet despite that foreign policy mess, he wins re-election in 1916. How did that happen?
Well, the political landscape had shifted. Teddy Roosevelt refused to run for the Progressive Party again, so that party basically dissolved. The Republicans nominated Charles Evans Hughes, a Supreme Court justice.
And Hughes attacked Wilson's record.
Oh, yeah. Criticized the tariff cuts, the trust policies, and especially Wilson's handling of Mexico and the growing tensions with Germany over submarine warfare.
So Wilson ran on.
The Democrats nominated Wilson easily, and their big slogan was, "He kept us out of war." It was powerful, even though Wilson himself apparently worried it might not hold true for long.
And they painted Hughes as the pro-war candidate.
They definitely warned voters that electing Hughes would mean getting dragged into the European war.
How close was the election?
It was actually quite close in the popular vote and the Electoral College. Wilson won, but it wasn't a landslide.
Where did his support come from?
He did very well in the Midwest and the West. That seems to be a combination of support for his progressive domestic reforms and the strong anti-war sentiment in those regions. He also got significant support from organized labor and many voters who had backed Roosevelt's Progressive Party in 1912.
So the peace slogan worked, even if peace didn't last.
Exactly. Voters hoping to stay out of the war backed Wilson, but as we know, that hope was sadly misplaced. American entry into World War I was just around the corner.
So looking back at that first term, it's just packed with major domestic changes. The tariff, the Fed, the antitrust acts. He really did shake up that triple wall.
Absolutely. The sheer volume and impact of the legislation is remarkable. It fundamentally altered the relationship between the government and the economy, laying groundwork for much of the 20th century.
But it's impossible to separate that from the deep contradictions, isn't it?
Yeah.
The progressive push happening alongside, well, blatant racism and discriminatory actions by his administration.
That you absolutely can't separate them. It highlights the complexities and, frankly, the limitations of the progressive era. Progress for whom? That's always the question. His administration advanced some things while actively rolling back rights for African Americans.
And the foreign policy. Starting with anti-imperialist talk, but ending with multiple interventions and the messy situation in Mexico. A very mixed bag.
Definitely mixed. Idealism often clashed with perceived national interests or perhaps a certain moralistic interventionism on Wilson's part. It certainly didn't create the stable, democratic neighborhood he might have envisioned.
So considering all this, the domestic reforms, the social blind spots, the foreign policy struggles, what really defines the progressive era under Wilson? And how did it set the table for everything that came after in the 20th century?
That really is the core question, isn't it? Wilson's first term perfectly captures the era's ambition, this drive to use government to fix modern problems, but also its profound inconsistencies, particularly on race. It established a more powerful federal government, reshaped the economy, and reflected America's growing, if sometimes clumsy, engagement with the world, all of which were central themes for the decades that followed, including the looming World War.
A fascinating and really complex period. There's clearly so much there for you to think about how these reforms played out, the long-term consequences, the figures involved.
Yeah.
Hopefully this deep dive has given you a solid framework to explore further.